The summer we went camping in the deep woods of Vermont is something I can't shake, even years later. It started as a simple getaway. Four friends eager to escape the city's heat and noise, craving the quiet that only the forest could offer. The place we picked was remote but not unknown, a small state park tucked away from the main roads, where the trees were thick and the nights went dark enough to swallow the stars. We arrived mid-afternoon, the air already heavy with humidity, the sun filtering through leaves in mottled golden patterns. Our plan was to spend 3 days hiking, swimming in the lake, and just being outside without distractions. I was with my friends Jason, Emily, and Mark. We'd known each other since college, bonded over shared love for adventure and cheap beer. The first day went smoothly. We hiked a few miles on the designated trails, laughed over burnt marshmallows, and told stories by the campfire late into the night. The sounds of the forest were alive all around us, cicadas humming, leaves rustling, the occasional call of an owl. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. But when the second night came, something changed. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly to a faint noise. At first I thought it was the wind, branches scraping against the tents, but then it came again, slower and closer. A soft tapping is like someone knocking on wood. The sound circled our campsite, moving from tree to tree. I nudged Jason, who was sleeping nearby. "Did you hear that?" He shook his head groggily. "What?" "There's something out there." We both sat up quietly, listening. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't random. Someone was doing it on purpose. Emily and Mark were still asleep, so we didn't want to wake them up. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around us. But no one was there. The tapping stopped. A sudden chill ran down my spine. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I closed the tent and lay back down, heart pounding. Jason was wide awake now, whispering, "Maybe it's an animal?" I wasn't convinced. The next day, we tried to brush it off. The heat was oppressive, and the lake was cool and inviting. We spent the afternoon swimming and fishing, letting the sun dry us off before dinner. But as the sun set, the unease crept back in. That evening, we gathered around the campfire, telling stories to distract ourselves. Mark started talking about a local legend, a woman who had vanished in the woods decades ago. They said she had been searching for her lost child and had disappeared without a trace. Some claimed her spirit still wandered the forest, trying to find her way home. The story was eerie, but didn't faze us much. Just another campfire tale. After the fire died down and we retreated to our tents, the tapping returned. This time it was louder and more insistent. It came in pulses. Tap, 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 tap. I could swear it was trying to mimic a pattern, almost like a code. I lay frozen, listening. Then, from the shadows near the tree line, a faint figure emerged. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow or a tree branch moving in the breeze. But the figure took shape. A woman, pale and translucent, dressed in a long white gown that fluttered as if underwater. Her face was blurred, expressionless, but her eyes, when they met mine, were full of sorrow. I wanted to call out, to wake the others, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure slowly raised one hand and pointed toward the woods, then vanished. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I told the others what I'd seen. Jason dismissed it as a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and heat. Mark joked that I was scared of ghosts. Emily, however, looked uneasy. She confessed that she'd seen the figure too, but hadn't wanted to say anything. Determined to find out more, we decided to explore the area around the campsite, searching for any signs or history related to the woman in white. As we wandered deeper into the woods, the atmosphere thickened. The air was cooler, almost damp, with something we couldn't place. We came across a small clearing where the ground was unusually bare. In the center was a single weathered wooden cross, partially covered in moss. The name Margaret was carved into it, along with a date from the 1940s. Nearby, scattered shards of porcelain and a faded photograph lay half buried in the dirt. Emily picked up the photo, wiping off years of grime. It showed a woman holding a child, both smiling gently. The resemblance to the figure we saw was uncanny. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply and the forest grew eerily silent. The hairs on my arms stood on end. We all felt it, the presence. Without warning, the underbrush rustled and a cold wind swept through the clearing. We heard a faint whisper, a name carried on the breeze, Margaret. We didn't wait to see what else might appear. We hurried back to the campsite, our nerves raw. That night, as we packed our gear to leave early, the tapping started again. But this time, it came from inside our tents, the sound of nails scraping fabric, slow and steady. We gathered our things in silence, not daring to look around. The forest seemed to close in on us, suffocating and dark. When we finally reached the car and locked the doors behind us, the tapping stopped. We didn't speak much on the drive back. The experience had shaken us all in ways we didn't fully understand. Years later, I still think about that summer, about the woman who wandered those woods searching for something lost. I sometimes wonder if she found peace, or if she's still out there waiting for someone to listen. The woods never felt quite the same after that trip, and I never camped in those parts again. Story the end. The summer before my final year of college, I joined a group of friends for a camping trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains. We wanted to get away from everything: noise, screens, schedules, just us and the forest, miles from anything that resembled civilization. We had all done plenty of camping before, nothing out of the ordinary, but this trip left a mark none of us will ever forget. The plan was simple: hike into a remote spot near an old logging trail, set up camp, and spend a week there. The area had sparse cell service and no real facilities, but the wilderness was pristine and beautiful. We all pitched in to carry gear and food for 5 days. The sun was hot and relentless that day, and the forest thick with towering oaks and maples, their leaves dense and green, blocking much of the sunlight. There were 6 of us: me, my roommate James, his girlfriend Lily, my best friend Claire, Claire's boyfriend Matt, and Matt's brother Eric. We were close, college friends who had grown up in cities but loved the idea of wilderness survival, even if it was just for a week. Our hike started in the morning and stretched into the afternoon. We followed the logging trail through steep hills and creeks, spotting the occasional animal track or fresh scat. As the day wore on, the trees grew older and thicker, the underbrush thicker too. By the time we reached the clearing for our campsite, the sun was dipping low. The clearing was wide, grassy, with a small creek babbling nearby. There was an old fire pit surrounded by blackened stones, evidence of previous campers, but no recent signs of visitors. We were eager to set up tents and start a fire before darkness swallowed the forest. That night, after eating canned chili and roasting marshmallows, we sat around the fire sharing stories and jokes. The air was cooler than expected, but still heavy with summer humidity. Around midnight, I went to the creek to refill my water bottle. The moon was high but veiled by thin clouds, casting a silvery light on the water. As I knelt by the creek, I thought I heard something behind me, a faint rustle in the bushes. I turned, flashlight raised, but saw nothing. The forest was silent except for the creek's steady murmur. I shrugged it off and went back to camp. That night, I had strange dreams. I dreamt I was walking through the woods, but the trees weren't right. They were twisted, blackened, and the ground was dry and cracked like a desert. I could hear a woman whispering, calling my name softly but urgently. I woke suddenly, sweat soaking my shirt. The tent was still warm and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I told myself it was just a nightmare. The next morning, James mentioned he had trouble sleeping, that he felt like something was watching us. I thought he was just spooked by the stories Claire had told about local legends, about spirits of lost loggers and mountain women who vanished in the woods. We spent the day hiking around the area, exploring an abandoned cabin a few miles away. The cabin was falling apart, its roof caved in and windows boarded with rotting planks. Inside, the air was stale and smelled like mold and rot. We found old tools scattered on the floor and a faded photograph of a family in black and white. That evening, the mood shifted. After dinner, we noticed the fire wasn't burning as bright. The air felt colder, almost unnatural. The woods around us seemed to press in closer. Lily said she saw shadows moving beyond the tree line, shapes that didn't look like animals. Matt agreed, but Eric was dismissive. We went to bed uneasy. At about 2 a.m., I was woken by a strange sound. It wasn't the usual night noises of owls or insects. It was a low moaning, barely audible but persistent. I shook Claire awake, whispering if she heard it. She did, and we decided to wake the others. The moaning grew louder, mixed with the snapping of twigs and the rustling of leaves. Then, suddenly, the fire outside the tents flickered violently and went out. Panic settled in. We grabbed flashlights and went outside, hearts pounding. The forest around us was dark and still, except for the sounds we had heard. Matt spotted footprints in the dirt near the fire pit. They were large, barefoot, and seemed too long for any of us. The prints led toward the creek, but vanished near the water's edge. Suddenly, a piercing scream cut through the night. It was Lily. She was pointing toward the woods, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. A figure was standing just beyond the tree line. A tall woman in a long white dress, soaked and stained with mud. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face, and her eyes were dark and hollow. The woman didn't move, but stared at us, her mouth open in that same low moaning sound. We ran back to our tents and locked ourselves inside. None of us slept again. By dawn, the apparition was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. We packed up immediately and took a different trail back, trying not to look back. Once we reached the ranger station, we told the story. The ranger nodded grimly and told us about the Weeping Bride, a local legend about a woman who drowned in the creek after her fiancé vanished in a logging accident. She was said to haunt the woods, searching for him, and anyone who saw her was never quite the same. We never returned to that spot. Even now, years later, I can't forget the cold, empty eyes of that woman in white, or the way the forest fell silent around us. Some nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear her moaning carried on the breeze. Story the end. The summer I was 21, my two closest friends, Mark and Jenna, and I decided to go camping in the remote forests of northern Maine. We wanted to get away from everything, the city, our jobs, the endless noise, and find a place where we could just be quiet for a while. Jenna's uncle had once told her about a spot near Baxter State Park, a place called Dead Man's Hollow. The name alone sent a shiver down our spines, but we were all curious, thinking it was just an old legend designed to keep tourists away. We packed up my old Jeep with tents, sleeping bags, food, and enough firewood to last the weekend. The drive was long and winding, the roads getting narrower and more treacherous the further north we went. When we finally reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon, the sun already starting to dip behind the dense pines. The trail was rough but beautiful. The smell of damp earth and pine needles was intoxicating. We joked about the name Dead Man's Hollow as we walked, laughing at our own nervousness. The trail led us deeper into the forest, and after about 2 hours, we arrived at a small clearing surrounded by thick trees with a narrow stream running through it. This was our campsite. We set up camp quickly and gathered wood for a fire. The sun was gone by the time we had the fire crackling, and the forest around us grew dark and mysterious. We roasted hot dogs, told stories, and laughed until our voices grew hoarse. It was the kind of night where the stars are so bright you feel like you could reach out and touch them. Around 11 p.m., Mark and Jenna had already gone to their tents, and I sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Then I heard it, a faint whispering coming from the trees across the hollow. It was almost inaudible, but definitely there. I called out, "Mark? Jenna?" But there was no answer. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks. I stood, stretched, and decided to check on them. As I walked towards their tents, the whispering grew louder. It didn't sound like wind anymore. It was words, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I switched on my flashlight and swept the beam across the dark woods. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw a figure, small, hunched over, motionless. I blinked, and it vanished. I hurried back to camp and woke Mark. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He frowned. "Hear what?" "The whispering. And I saw someone out there." He rolled over. "You're just tired. Go back to sleep." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to spook them. I went back to my tent, zipped up, and lay awake listening to the whispering, which never quite stopped. The next morning, we found strange markings carved into the bark of the trees surrounding the clearing. They were symbols none of us recognized, jagged and darkened with age. I felt uneasy, but Mark insisted they were probably Native American or old logging marks. We spent the day hiking and exploring, but the deeper into the forest we went, the more the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Near an old stone foundation, we found a rusted lantern and what looked like old bones, bleached white and cracked. Jenna grew pale. "We should leave," she whispered. That night, the fire was barely aglow, and the whispering started again, louder this time. The voice was more distinct, a woman's voice, soft and sad, calling a name none of us recognized. We sat close together, too afraid to sleep. Around midnight, something brushed past the edge of the clearing, breaking a branch. The flashlight beams flicked wildly, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, the fire went out. In the pitch black, the whispering stopped. A chilling silence fell over us. Then, from all around, came a chorus of mournful voices, weeping and calling out in despair. We scrambled to relight the fire, our hands trembling. When the flames finally caught, we saw them, shadows flickering just beyond the firelight. Figures of people, translucent and sorrowful, standing silently and watching us. We didn't speak. None of us moved. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures vanished. By dawn, we packed up without saying a word and hiked out, the weight of those voices heavy in our minds. Back in town, we learned that Dead Man's Hollow had been the site of a logging camp disaster in the early 1900s, where a fire had trapped several workers who died trying to escape. Since then, locals claimed the spirits of those men and women haunted the hollow, their cries carried by the wind. We never camped again in that forest. Even years later, I sometimes hear faint whispering on summer nights, and the chill that came from those shadows lingers like a memory. Story. The end. The summer I turned 25, I convinced my two closest friends, Emily and Jake, to join me on a camping trip deep in the Cascade Mountains of Washington. We'd been talking about it for months. A break from our relentless city jobs, a chance to disconnect and breathe fresh mountain air. Emily was the planner. Jake was the laid-back outdoorsman, and I was somewhere in the middle, eager for adventure but cautious enough to keep us safe. We picked a remote site by an old logging road near a little-known lake called Mirror Lake. It was supposed to be beautiful, off the radar, and perfect for fishing and swimming. Markers on the maps showed only a faint trail leading there, which added to its appeal. It felt like a secret waiting to be discovered. The drive was long, the final leg over narrow dirt roads that zigzagged through towering firs. The car rattled over potholes, and at one point, a fallen tree forced us to backtrack and find a different path. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon, the forest around us bathed in that golden glow that only summer evenings can bring. We set up camp quickly, eager to get the fire going before nightfall. The lake lay just beyond a small stand of trees, a dark mirror reflecting the crimson sky. The air was cool and fragrant with pine and damp earth. We ate cold sandwiches and drank warm beer, telling stories and laughing around the fire. The peace felt unreal, like we had stumbled into a forgotten world. That first night, I fell asleep under a quilt of stars. I remember the way the forest seemed alive but gentle, the whisper of wind in the branches, the faint splash of fish in the lake. But somewhere around midnight, I woke. The temperature had dropped sharply, and the camp was silent, except for the crackling fire. Something felt off. I heard a rustling in the bushes, soft and deliberate. I nudged Emily, who was lying next to me, but she was out cold. I shushed Jake awake, and we both listened. There it was again, a faint, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled through dry leaves. Jake grabbed his flashlight and cautiously unzipped his tent. He swept the beam around the clearing. Nothing, just the forest, black and silent beyond the firelight. "Probably just a deer," he whispered. "Hey," but I wasn't convinced. The next morning, over coffee, Emily told us she'd had a strange dream. A woman in white standing at the edge of the lake, her hair hanging in wet strands, eyes dark and hollow. We joked about it, but an uneasy feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. We spent the day exploring the trails around the lake. The forest thickened as we climbed higher, the air damp and cool under the canopy. We found an old, moss-covered cabin, half swallowed by the undergrowth. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Inside, the floor was littered with rotting wood and broken glass. On a table sat a rusted lantern and an old diary, yellowed with age. Emily leafed through the diary, her face growing pale. The entries were from a woman named Clara, who had lived there in the early 1900s. She wrote of loneliness, of waiting for her husband who never returned from a logging expedition. The last entries grew frantic. mentions of strange sounds in the night, of shadows moving beyond the trees, of a presence that watched her constantly. We decided to take the diary back to camp, thinking it might be a cool piece of local history. That night, the fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the lake and creeping into the trees. The fire's warmth felt faint against the chill. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, it wasn't just a noise. I heard a voice, soft, distant, calling my name. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The voice was repeated, pleading, desperate. Emily stirred awake, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jake shook his head, groggy. "Probably just the wind." We huddled by the fire, trying to ignore the rising fear. Then, from the edge of the clearing, the fog parted and a figure emerged. She was exactly like Clara described in the diary, a woman in a soaked white dress, hair matted and hanging in front of her face, eyes sunken and hollow. She moved slowly toward us, her bare feet making no sound on the forest floor. "Help me," she whispered, voice cracking. We were frozen. The fire flickered wildly, and suddenly the temperature plunged. The woman's lips parted, but no words came out, just a haunting wail that chilled our bones. Jake finally grabbed a stick and swung at her, but his blow passed through empty air. She vanished into the fog as quickly as she had appeared. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, we packed up and left Mirror Lake behind us. Driving away, the dense forest closed in around the road, and I glanced back once, catching a glimpse of a white figure watching us from the trees. Weeks later, back in the city, I tried to dismiss what we'd experienced as a shared hallucination, the product of isolation and stress. But then I received a package. Inside was Clara's diary, the same one we had taken from the cabin, returned without note or explanation. The pages were damp and smeared, and on the last page, a single line was written in shaky handwriting, "Find me." I never went back to the lake, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the desperate voice calling my name. Story, the end. The summer after my sophomore year of college, I went on a camping trip that changed my life forever. It wasn't some wild adventure or an urban legend I'd heard on the internet. It was a real experience that left me shaken, and I still think about it years later. What makes it worse is that it's completely true. We were a group of 5 friends. Me, my best friend Rachel, her boyfriend Mark, my cousin Josh, and his girlfriend Emily. All of us had grown up in suburban areas, mostly comfortable and safe, so the idea of camping deep in the woods was thrilling but also a little unnerving. We planned to spend 5 days at a state park nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, a remote place with thick forests, rocky cliffs, and an old lake that wasn't popular with tourists. We chose the spot after reading online reviews that praised its beauty, but warned about the lack of cell reception and some eerie local stories. We laughed off the warnings, of course. Ghost stories are just stories, right? Still, there was something about the place that felt off. But we were young, confident, and eager for a break from school and city life. Our first day hiking in was uneventful. The trail wound through dense pine forests, the air thick with the smell of pine resin and damp earth. The sun was hot and bright, filtering through the needles overhead. As we walked, the chatter among us was lighthearted. Plans for campfire meals, swimming in the lake, late-night talks under the stars. I remember thinking how perfect it was. By late afternoon, we reached our designated campsite, a small clearing near the edge of the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the surrounding trees and the pinkish sky as the sun began to lower. We set up tents, gathered firewood, and prepared a meal. There was no cell signal here, just the sounds of nature, the gentle lapping of water, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional call of distant birds. As night fell, we lit a fire and sat around it, sharing snacks and telling stories. Rachel brought up the local legend of the Lady of the Lake, a tale we'd all read online. Supposedly, decades ago, a young woman drowned in that very lake under mysterious circumstances. Some said it was an accident. Others whispered about something darker. Jealous lovers, betrayal, revenge. Her spirit was said to roam the forest and water, seeking justice or perhaps peace. Most who claimed to have seen her described a figure in white, pale, and dripping wet, emerging from the water or standing silently on the shore. Mark made jokes about her, calling her the lake ghost, and dared anyone to swim at night. We all laughed, but as darkness deepened, I felt a creeping unease that I couldn't shake. We retreated to our tents early. The air cooled quickly, and the forest grew quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional splash from the lake. I lay on my sleeping pad, staring at the tent ceiling, eyes adjusting to the dark. Around midnight, I heard a sound. At first, it was so faint I thought it might be the wind, soft, rhythmic splashes near the lake's edge. Then I thought I heard a faint singing, a melody so quiet and melancholy it was almost swallowed by the night. I nudged Josh, who was sleeping nearby, and whispered if he heard it. He was awake too, and equally puzzled. We listened in silence, but the sound stopped. We told ourselves it was nothing, a fisherman's boat or some animal moving in the water. The next morning, everyone else seemed normal, but Josh and I couldn't get that eerie feeling out of our heads. We spent the day exploring, hiking further up the trail. The forest thickened, and the shadows grew longer as we climbed. At one point, Emily noticed strange carvings on a tree trunk, deep scratch marks that didn't look natural. We took pictures, but couldn't make sense of the symbols. Back at camp that night, the air was still and heavy. We built the fire again, but the flames flickered nervously. Rachel insisted on telling ghost stories to lighten the mood, but the usual campfire fun felt hollow. Suddenly, a chill swept across the clearing. The fire sputtered and dimmed, smoke curling unnaturally to one side despite the lack of wind. We all froze when a soft splash came from the lake, louder than before, followed by a slow, wet, dragging sound. Everyone looked toward the water. Then, from the darkness of the shoreline, a figure emerged. She was tall and slender, wearing a white dress that clung to her like seaweed. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face, dripping water onto the shore. Her eyes were dark and empty, and her mouth moved in a slow, wordless song that filled the night with sorrow. Mark grabbed Rachel's hand and whispered, "This can't be real." But she was. The figure stepped closer, moving soundlessly across the wet grass, stopping just at the edge of the firelight. Josh whispered, "We need to leave. Now." The ghost raised a pale hand and pointed toward the lake, her eyes never leaving us. Without hesitation, we packed in silence and hurried away from the shore. That night, sleep eluded all of us. At dawn, we decided to hike back the way we came, but the trail seemed different, twisted and unfamiliar. The trees that had been straight were now gnarled and leaning, blocking our path. After hours of wandering, we finally saw the parking lot where we'd left our car. It felt like a miracle. As we drove away, none of us spoke about what we'd seen, but we all knew that something had followed us. Weeks later, news came that a local hiker had disappeared near the lake. The circumstances were mysterious. His belongings were found on the shore, but no trace of him was ever recovered. The legend of the Lady of the Lake wasn't just a story anymore. And sometimes, when I'm near water or walking alone in the woods, I still hear that soft, sorrowful singing carried on the breeze. Story, the end. It started out as the perfect summer camping trip, the kind of getaway that city dwellers dream about during the stifling heat of July. 4 of us, me, my older brother Dan, and our 2 close friends, Lisa and Matt, piled into Dan's old SUV early on a Friday morning, ready to spend 3 days in the deep woods of the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. The plan was simple: hike, fish, swim, tell stories around the campfire, and sleep under the stars. We'd done this a few times before, but this time we chose a more remote site, one Dan had heard about from a local who warned that it was off the grid and untouched by other campers for weeks. We arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The sun was already high and blazing, but the forest promised cool shade. The trees towered overhead, their leaves whispering secrets in the light breeze. We loaded our backpacks, double-checked the gear, and headed down the narrow dirt path that would lead us to the creek where we planned to camp. The hike was harder than we expected. Steep inclines, thick underbrush, and the occasional muddy patch slowed us down. But the wilderness was beautiful and alive, filled with the buzz of insects and distant bird calls. After a couple of hours, we found a small clearing beside a babbling creek. It was perfect, flat ground, enough space for 2 tents, and close to the water. We set up camp quickly. Dan and Matt gathered firewood while Lisa and I unpacked. The creek water was icy cold and crystal clear, inviting us in after the sweaty hike. We spent the afternoon swimming, fishing, and exploring the area. As the sun began to lower, we built a campfire, cooking hot dogs and roasting marshmallows. The conversation flowed easily, stories from school, jokes, plans for the future. As darkness fell, the forest came alive in a different way. The temperature dropped, and the firelight flickered against the towering trees. We sat in a circle, telling ghost stories, the way you do in the woods late at night. Around midnight, we all crawled into our tents. The sounds of the night were all around. Crickets chirping, frogs croaking, and the creek gently rushing past. I was just about to fall asleep when I heard it. A faint knocking sound, like someone tapping on wood. At first, I thought it was a branch brushing against the tent, but the tapping was rhythmic and deliberate. I nudged Dan, who was sleeping next to me in the other tent. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred, but said nothing. Maybe he thought I was dreaming. The tapping continued for another minute, then stopped. I held my breath, listening, but nothing else came. The next morning, I mentioned it over breakfast, but Dan shrugged it off. "Probably just a woodpecker or something," he said. We hiked further up the trail to a small ridge that overlooked the valley below. The view was breathtaking, endless green treetops stretching to the horizon, but something felt off. The forest here was quieter than before, almost too quiet. No birdsong, no rustling animals, just stillness. On the way back, we stumbled across an old weathered sign nailed to a tree. The faded paint read, "Property of the Decker family. Trespassers will be prosecuted." None of us had heard about any private property here, but we decided to respect the sign and stayed on the main trail. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time, coming from just beyond the campfire ring. Matt grabbed his flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam found nothing. The knocking stopped abruptly. Later, when we were all trying to sleep, Lisa woke me up. "Did you hear footsteps?" she asked in a hushed voice. "I thought it was just me," I said. She told me she'd heard slow, deliberate steps crunching through the underbrush, circling our campsite. No one else seemed to hear them. The following day, unease settled over us like a fog. We tried to ignore it, but little things kept happening. The firewood we'd stacked neatly was scattered. Our backpacks were moved slightly from where we'd left them. Strange shadows flickered just beyond the tree line, vanishing when we looked directly. On our last afternoon, we decided to explore a nearby abandoned cabin that we'd spotted from a distance. The cabin was old, boarded up, and covered in ivy. We found an open window and climbed inside carefully. The air was stale, and the floorboards creaked beneath our feet. On the wall was a faded photograph of a family, a man, a woman, and a little girl, all smiling. Underneath, someone had scrawled a date, 1923. Suddenly, Lisa gasped. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to a corner where a small pile of ashes lay next to an old rusted locket. As we examined the cabin, the temperature dropped sharply. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I felt a presence, something watching us. We hurried outside, hearts pounding. That night, the tapping turned into pounding, heavy, angry beats on the tent walls. We huddled together, too scared to move. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Before dawn, I was woken by a whispering voice outside my tent. It was soft but clear, saying a name, Evelyn. The others heard it too. None of us had any idea who Evelyn was. When we packed up that morning, we found deep scratches in the dirt around the campsite, marks that couldn't be from animals or humans walking normally. They formed a circle around our fire pit. On the way out of the forest, Dan told us that he'd done some research after we returned. The land we camped on had once belonged to the Decker family. Evelyn was the daughter who disappeared mysteriously one summer night, nearly 100 years ago. Some say she was lost in the woods, others say worse. I still can't forget those tapping sounds, the footsteps, or the way the temperature dropped in that cabin. Every summer since, when I think about camping, a shiver runs down my spine. Maybe Evelyn is still out there, waiting for someone to hear her story. Story the end. It was the summer after my first year of college when my group of friends decided to go camping in the woods of northern Vermont. We'd all grown up in cities and suburbs, and none of us were exactly outdoorsy, but we wanted to push ourselves, experience something real and raw. The plan was simple. Drive up, hike into a remote spot, set camp for 3 days, and then come back. No phones, no distractions, just nature and us. There were 5 of us. Me, Alex, Sarah, Matt, and Lila. We'd been friends since high school, and this was our first big trip together. We researched and finally chose a spot deep in the Green Mountains near a place called Cold Creek Hollow. According to some old forum posts and a handful of local blogs, it was mostly untouched, very quiet, and perfect for camping. We arrived at the trailhead midday, loaded down with backpacks, tents, and supplies. The sun was bright and warm, and the air smelled like pine and moss. The hike-in took longer than we thought, about 5 miles on narrow, rugged paths that wound up and down through dense forest. The last stretch had us scrambling over fallen logs and loose rocks, but when we finally broke through the trees, the clearing was breathtaking. A small, crystal-clear creek ran through it, bordered by ferns and wildflowers. We quickly set up camp on a flat patch near the water, eager to start the fire and relax. The mood was light and cheerful as we cooked burgers and traded stories around the campfire. The night was cool but comfortable, with a sky so full of stars it felt like you could reach out and touch them. Around 11 p.m., I decided to go for a walk by myself along the creek, needing a moment away from the fire and chatter. The water gurgled softly in the darkness, and the trees swayed gently with the breeze. As I moved further downstream, I started hearing something else, a faint humming, like a song someone was singing far away. I stopped, listening closely. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, a woman's voice, soft and mournful, singing a tune I didn't recognize. It wasn't creepy exactly, more sad. I called out, "Hello?" But the humming stopped. There was only the sound of the creek and the rustling leaves again. I shrugged and turned back. When I returned, the fire was low and the others were talking quietly. I didn't mention the singing, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. The second day, we went hiking farther up the trail, exploring an old logging road that hadn't been used in decades. The forest there was thick and dark, the trees so tall they blocked out much of the sunlight. We found an old stone foundation covered in moss and vines, remnants of some forgotten cabin. As we poked around, Lila found something buried beneath the dirt near the foundation, a rusted tin box. Inside were yellowed papers, brittle photographs, and a small, leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to a man named Thomas, who had lived there in the early 1900s. His writing described life in the forest, the hard work of logging, and something strange that happened one summer. According to Thomas, one night, a woman appeared by the creek singing a haunting song. She had long dark hair and pale skin, and her voice lured men into the woods, where they never returned. Thomas wrote that he'd heard her singing several times, and that she was both beautiful and terrifying. He warned anyone who found the journal to stay away from the creek after dark. We laughed it off, calling it a ghost story made up by a lonely logger. That night after dinner, the mood shifted. The forest grew still, the usual sounds of crickets and frogs suddenly silent. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, came the singing again. It was that same soft, sad voice, drifting across the hollow. We froze, staring into the darkness. Sarah whispered, "Did you hear that?" "It's probably just the wind," Matt said, though he didn't sound convinced. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence that seemed to press down on us. Later, as we sat close to the dying fire, I noticed shadows flickering just beyond the ring of light. I could have sworn I saw a figure standing by the creek, thin, with long dark hair that glimmered faintly in the moonlight. When I pointed it out, no one else saw anything. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the song in my head. I felt like something was watching us, waiting. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a scream. It was Sarah's voice, high and terrified. I leapt from my tent and found her shaking violently, staring at the trees where a faint silhouette stood between the trunks. "Did you see it?" She gasped. "We all did," I said, trying to sound calm. Suddenly, the singing started again, louder this time, echoing through the hollow like a mournful lament. The figure by the creek grew clearer, a pale woman in a tattered white dress, her eyes hollow and black. We ran to the fire and threw more wood on it, the flames roaring back to life. The figure vanished into the night. By dawn, we decided to pack up and leave. The forest felt wrong, heavy with grief and sorrow we couldn't explain. On the hike back, the woods were eerily quiet, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that woman following us. When we finally reached the trailhead, our Jeep felt like a sanctuary. We didn't talk much on the drive home, each of us lost in our thoughts. Later, I researched Cold Creek Hollow. There was a story about a woman named Eliza who had drowned in the creek over a century ago. Her body never found. Locals said her spirit haunted the forest, singing a song that lured people to her watery grave. I still hear that song sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right. It's beautiful and terrible, like a sorrow that never dies. Story the end. The summer I turned 24, my friends and I planned a camping trip in the mountains of West Virginia. It was supposed to be a simple getaway, a few days in the wilderness to escape our hectic city lives. The spot was somewhere near the Monongahela National Forest, a place known for its dense woods, clear streams, and old logging trails. We didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just hiking, swimming, and sitting around a campfire under the stars. There were 5 of us. Me, my girlfriend Lisa, my best friend Aaron, his sister Sarah, and her boyfriend Mark. We all shared a love for the outdoors, but none of us were particularly skilled campers. We rented some gear, packed what we thought we'd need, and set off early on a Friday morning. The drive was long but beautiful. The road wound through rolling hills and dense forests, the trees stretching tall and thick. By early afternoon, we reached the trailhead and began hiking a few miles to the campsite. The forest was cool and alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Every so often, we stopped to admire the wildflowers or take photos near the stream that ran beside the trail. When we arrived, the clearing was surrounded by towering oaks and maples. A small fire ring was already built, and the ground was soft with pine needles. We set up our tents, collected firewood, and got a fire going as the sun began to set. The first night was perfect. We cooked hot dogs, roasted marshmallows, and swapped stories around the flickering flames. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brilliantly. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, adding to the forest's natural symphony. But as the night deepened, a strange feeling crept over me. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. The usual chorus of crickets and frogs ceased entirely. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, a faint whispering came from beyond the tree line. At first I thought it was just the breeze playing tricks, but the whispering grew louder. Soft voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They sounded like multiple people, their tones urgent but subdued. I called out to the others, but they either hadn't heard or were ignoring it. Lisa squeezed my hand, her eyes wide. Aaron shrugged it off as an animal or other campers nearby, but the campsite was supposed to be isolated. We tried to sleep, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was watching us. Around midnight, Lisa woke me, saying she'd seen a faint figure standing just beyond the glow of our firelight. A woman in a flowing white dress, pale and translucent, with long hair drifting in the breeze. When I looked, she was gone. The next day, we found old remnants near the campsite, rusted tools, a broken lantern, and a weathered journal half buried in the dirt. The journal's pages were brittle, filled with hurried scrawlings about someone named Mary, a woman who had lived there over 100 years ago. According to the journal, Mary was a widow who lost her husband in the forest. She wrote about hearing voices calling her name, seeing lights flickering among the trees, and feeling watched. She ended her writings abruptly, leaving us with a chill. That evening, the whispering returned, clearer and more persistent. We heard footsteps circling the camp, and the fire flickered wildly despite the still air. Suddenly, a cold gust swept through the clearing, extinguishing the flames. In the darkness, the figure appeared again, closer this time, her hollow eyes fixed on us. She let out a low, mournful wail that pierced the silence. Panicked, we scrambled to relight the fire, finally managing to get the flames roaring again. The figure vanished instantly, but the unease remained. We packed up early the next morning and left without looking back. On the drive home, none of us spoke much, the weight of the experience heavy in the air. To this day, I can't explain what we saw or heard, but I know it was real. Sometimes, on quiet summer nights, I still think I hear that whispering, a reminder that some places hold memories that never fade. Story the end. It was the summer after my last year of high school, a time when everything felt like a threshold to the unknown, a mix of excitement and dread. My friends and I decided to take a week-long camping trip in the mountains of western Pennsylvania. We wanted a break from the noise of the city, from the pressure of college decisions and looming adulthood. The plan was simple: pack our tents, food, and some beers, and disappear into the wilderness. None of us believed in ghosts, but the stories we heard about that area stuck in the back of my mind as we prepared. The forest we were heading into was near an old mining town called Eckley, a place mostly abandoned and rumored to be haunted. We had no particular interest in ghost stories, but locals had warned us to avoid certain parts of the woods, especially after dark. We laughed it off. Still, my friend Lisa, who was a little more superstitious, insisted on bringing a small cross necklace, which she said was just a joke to keep the mood light. Our first day hiking in was grueling. The trail was steeper and rougher than the map suggested, and the summer sun was merciless, making every step heavy. When we finally found a clearing near an old stone foundation, we set up camp. The place was eerie, but beautiful. Wildflowers in the grass, a creek running nearby, and trees towering like silent sentinels. We joked about how this was probably the perfect ghost hunting spot, but mostly we just wanted to relax. That first night, after a dinner of canned chili and grilled hot dogs, we gathered around the campfire. The forest sounds surrounded us. The crackling fire, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of leaves stirred by a gentle breeze. Lisa brought out a deck of cards and suggested we play a game to pass the time. As the night deepened, the woods grew quieter, the usual insect chorus fading into silence. It was then that I first noticed the feeling of being watched. Not the playful thrill of eyes in the dark, but something colder, more deliberate. I told myself it was just nerves. Around 11 p.m., a strange noise broke the silence, a soft tapping like fingernails against wood, coming from the direction of the old foundation ruins a few yards from our tents. Lisa's eyes widened, and even Mark, who was usually the skeptic, paused. "Probably just a woodpecker," he said, but the tapping came again. It was slow, rhythmic, almost like a deliberate message. We shone our flashlights toward the ruins, but saw nothing. I volunteered to check it out, feeling foolish but curious. As I approached, the tapping stopped abruptly. The air felt colder near the ruins, and an overwhelming sense of dread swept over me. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw a faint flicker of light inside the broken stone walls. A candle, maybe? But there was no way anyone could have gotten in without us hearing. I called the others over, but by the time they arrived, the light was gone. We stood in uneasy silence, the fire behind us the only source of warmth and comfort. Lisa whispered a quick prayer, and we retreated to our tents, locking the zippers. Sleep was fitful at best. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of whispering, soft voices just outside my tent, unintelligible but urgent. I held my breath, frozen. The whispering faded as suddenly as it had started. I dared not move or speak. The next morning, Lisa said she saw strange footprints around our tents, barefoot but too large and elongated for any of us. We checked the perimeter, but the forest seemed undisturbed beyond those tracks. Mark joked that maybe a bear had wandered through, but bears don't leave such neat prints. That day, we decided to hike toward an old mining shaft we'd read about. It was supposed to be sealed off, but adventurers sometimes found ways in. The trail took us deeper into the woods, and the sunlight dimmed beneath the dense canopy. The air smelled damp and earthy, mixed with faint traces of rust and decay. At the entrance to the mine, we found old tools and rusted rails, a testimony to the men who worked there decades ago. The mine was dark, and though the opening was mostly blocked, there was enough space to peer inside. I shone my flashlight into the blackness and thought I saw a pair of eyes reflecting back at me. When I blinked, they were gone. We agreed to leave and head back, but as we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was trailing us, something patient and watching. Back at camp, night fell fast. The woods took on an oppressive silence. Our fire sputtered and died quickly, as if the air itself resisted the flames. Then we heard it. The tapping again, this time on the side of Josh's tent. It was soft but distinct. Josh flung open the tent flap, shining his light into the dark. Nothing was there. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew through the clearing, extinguishing our last candles. The forest plunged into pitch black, except for the pale moonlight filtering through the leaves. Then, the whispering returned. This time louder, coming from all directions, circling us. Words in a language none of us understood, but the tone was desperate, filled with sorrow and anger. Lisa screamed. Mark grabbed her hand. We huddled together, hearts pounding. From the ruins, a faint glow emerged. Slowly, a figure appeared, a woman in tattered white, her face pale and eyes hollow. She moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, reaching toward us with trembling hands. We didn't run. We couldn't. The cold seeped into our bones, the sorrow in her eyes paralyzing. Then, with a final mournful wail, she vanished. We broke camp at first light. None of us spoke of the experience, except in whispers, afraid to even think about it. Back in the city, I researched the history of Eckley and found records of a mining accident that killed a woman named Mary, a miner's wife, who had lost her husband and drowned in the creek near our campsite while searching for him. Locals said her spirit wandered, searching, grieving. I never went camping again. And sometimes, on quiet summer nights, I swear I hear the faint tapping of fingernails on wood and the soft, sorrowful whisper of a woman calling out from the dark. Story the end. The summer I went camping with my friends in the deep woods of the Adirondacks is something I still think about, even though it happened over a decade ago. It was supposed to be a simple escape from the city heat. 4 days in the wilderness, no phones, no distractions, just nature and good company. What happened, though, was something none of us expected, and none of us ever fully understood. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon, late July, the kind of hot, sticky day where the sun feels like it's pressing down on you. The four of us, me, my longtime friend Sarah, her boyfriend Matt, and my cousin Jake, had planned this trip for months. We drove up from Albany in Jake's old pickup truck, loaded with tents, food, and fishing gear. Our destination was a remote campsite near a little-known lake called Shadow Lake, nestled deep inside the forest. The place was beautiful. Tall pines, crystal-clear water, and a silence that was almost deafening. You could feel the distance from civilization with every step into the woods. The hike to the campsite was rougher than we expected. The trail wasn't well marked, overgrown in places, and the humidity made it hard to breathe. But when we finally reached the clearing by the lake, all the exhaustion disappeared. The water shimmered under the late afternoon sun, the trees stretched endlessly, and for a moment, it felt like we had stepped into another world. We set up camp quickly, 2 tents side by side, a fire pit between them. The first night was perfect. We cooked hot dogs over the fire, told stories, and stared up at a sky filled with stars. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional splash of something in the lake. Around midnight, I was woken up by the sound of water lapping softly against the shore. I stepped out of my tent to get a better look. And that's when I saw it, a faint light bobbing across the lake. It wasn't a lantern or a flashlight. It moved slowly, almost floating just above the water. I called Sarah and Matt to look, but by the time they came out, the light had vanished. We shrugged it off, thinking it might have been a reflection or someone fishing on the other side. But none of us really slept well after that. The next day, we decided to explore the area around the lake. While wandering through the forest, Jake found an old, dilapidated cabin hidden beneath the trees. The door hung open on rusty hinges, and inside, the floor was littered with broken glass, fallen beams, and strange symbols drawn in charcoal on the walls. We took photos and joked nervously about the haunted cabin. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. That night, as we sat around the fire, Sarah told a local legend she'd heard about Shadow Lake, a story about a woman named Eliza who had drowned there a century ago. According to the tale, Eliza's spirit never left the lake, searching endlessly for her lost child. Locals warned that those who camped too close might see her wandering near the water at night. The fire flickered and the wind whispered through the trees, making the story feel all too real. After the fire died down, we retreated to our tents, but the unease lingered. I lay awake for hours, hearing the sounds of the forest, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, but also something else. Soft, indistinct whispers carried on the night air. Around 2 a.m., the whispers grew louder, almost like a voice calling my name. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate steps circling our campsite. I sat up and shone my flashlight into the trees. The beam caught something, a pale figure standing just beyond the firelight. The figure was draped in a tattered white dress, face obscured by long, wet hair. I froze, heart pounding. The figure raised a hand and pointed toward the lake before fading away into the darkness. I woke Sarah and Matt, but when they looked, the figure was gone. The rest of the night was a restless blur of uneasy dreams and half-heard sounds. The next morning, Jake found a message scratched into the bark of a tree near our tents. It read simply, "Find her." We packed up quickly, the tension too heavy to stay another night. As we hiked back to the truck, the woods felt different, darker, colder. We didn't speak much, each lost in our own thoughts. Back in town, I researched the story of Eliza. Newspapers from the early 1900s mentioned a woman who drowned in Shadow Lake after searching for her kidnapped child. The case was never solved, and locals still talked about strange sightings near the lake. I never went camping again after that summer, and I never forgot the feeling of being watched, the whispering voices, or the pale figure pointing silently toward the water. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear that soft tapping, like someone knocking gently on a door that's been closed for 100 years. Story the end. The summer I turned 28, I finally got the chance to take a break from the relentless pace of city life. My job had been draining me, and after another exhausting stretch of overtime, I desperately needed to get away. So I invited my two closest friends, Laura and Mike, for a camping trip. We planned to head to a remote area deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place I'd heard about from a local hiking forum, a spot with a small hidden lake called Hollow Pond, far off the beaten path without any cell phone coverage or crowds. We set out on a bright Friday morning in early July. The drive was long, winding through narrow mountain roads lined with towering oaks and pines. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the pavement. The air smelled fresh and earthy, a stark contrast to the city pollution we'd left behind. As we climbed higher, the temperature dropped, and the chatter in the car grew softer, replaced by the steady hum of the engine and the occasional bird call. The last few miles were on an unpaved dirt road that tested our old SUV's suspension. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches occasionally scraping the roof. When we finally reached the small clearing by the pond, the sun was dipping low behind the ridges, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The lake's surface was glassy, reflecting the sky and surrounding forest perfectly, almost eerily. We set up our tents quickly, working against the fading light. Mike, who was an avid fisherman, unpacked his gear excitedly, planning to try his luck in the morning. Laura and I started a fire while the sky darkened, the first stars blinking awake. The night was warm, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves overhead. We sat around the fire, sharing stories and roasting marshmallows. The crackling flames and occasional hoot of an owl created a perfect soundtrack for a summer night. After a while, we settled into our tents, the sounds of the forest lulling me towards sleep. I don't remember what time I woke up. Somewhere deep in the night, I was pulled from sleep by a strange sensation, a chill that cut through the summer warmth like an icy blade. I opened my eyes to darkness, but I could hear something faint, almost like whispering, coming from the edge of the clearing near the water. I nudged Laura awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She stirred and listened. "Yeah." "What is that?" We listened together as the whispers drifted in and out of the wind. They sounded like someone calling a name, but the words were too faint to understand clearly. Neither of us wanted to get out of our tents and investigate alone, and Mike was snoring loudly, oblivious. The whispers continued for maybe 20 minutes, then stopped. When morning came, we told Mike, who laughed it off. "Probably just the wind or an animal," he said. We spent the day hiking the trails around the pond. The forest was dense and alive, sunlight filtering through thick green leaves, the smell of moss and pine strong in the air. The trail led us to an old, abandoned cabin hidden among the trees, its paint long faded and peeling. We explored cautiously, noticing symbols carved into the doorframe, strange, unfamiliar runes scratched deep into the wood. Inside, we found an old journal lying on a dusty table. The pages were brittle and yellowed, written in cramped handwriting. It belonged to a man named Thomas Harding, who had lived there in the late 1800s. His entries told of isolation and despair, but most chillingly, he wrote about his wife, Eleanor, who had gone missing one stormy night. He described hearing her voice calling to him from the woods and feeling something watching him from the shadows. Laura shivered. "This place gives me the creeps." We brought the journal back to camp, thinking it was a fascinating glimpse into the past. That night, The whispers returned, louder this time, seeming to circle the clearing. Shadows flickered beyond the firelight, shapes that moved but had no form. Suddenly, the fire sputtered and went out, plunging us into darkness. We scrambled for matches as the whispers grew into anguished cries. From the fog rising off the pond, a figure appeared, a woman in a tattered white dress, her hair tangled and soaked, eyes hollow and pleading. "Thomas," she called out, her voice echoing through the trees. We froze, unable to look away as she glided closer, her feet not touching the ground. The air grew icy, our breath visible despite the summer night. Mike finally broke the spell, shouting to scare her away, but she vanished into the mist with a wail. We didn't sleep that night, too frightened to stay. At dawn, we packed up quickly and left, vowing never to return. Years later, I still hear that whisper whenever the summer nights grow heavy and the air is thick with fog. I wonder if Eleanor is still out there, searching for her lost love, trapped between worlds. Story the end.